Denzel Washington had learned a long time ago that a room tells you everything before anyone in it opens their mouth. He learned it in places most people will never see on a map, in conditions that turned a 2-second glance into the difference between walking out and not walking out. 14 years of that kind of attention doesn't leave you when you take the uniform off. It just finds quieter places to live. On a Thursday morning in October, it was living in a parking lot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it was about to cost a woman named Diane Halloway everything she thought she understood about herself. She didn't know that yet. She was standing at the entrance of Halloway Tactical Fleet in a charcoal blazer she'd had tailored twice, flanked by six members of her senior staff watching a beat-up work truck roll into her visitor lot like a stain spreading across a clean shirt. She would understand everything in about 90 minutes. Note, before we get there, if stories like this one are the reason you come back to this channel, hit subscribe now, because we tell one every single week. Real dignity, real consequences, the moments people don't see coming. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one. Now let's go back to 5:20 that morning, to a house on Larkspur Lane, and to a man who had no idea his whole life was about to be seen by someone who mattered. Denzel woke without an alarm. He hadn't needed one in 11 years, not since Afghanistan turned 5 a.m. Into something structural rather than something used as a nightstand. He made coffee. He poured too much of it into a second mug out of a habit he still hadn't broken, looked at it sitting there full and untouched, and poured it down the sink the way he did most mornings. He didn't let himself think about why. He'd gotten good at that. He made Nora's oatmeal, orange juice in the short glass, and knocked twice on her door at 6:15. Never 3 times. 3 times had meant something different once in another life, and he'd never told her why, and she'd never asked. Nora appeared in under 15 seconds, notebook already in hand, the same notebook she'd been filling since she was 6. Observations, questions, things she thought were worth keeping. "Big delivery today," she said, sliding into her chair. "The tactical fleet place. How many parts?" 3 axle assemblies, 1 transfer case. She wrote something down. "Back by pickup?" 3:15, same as always. That was the whole conversation, and it was also the whole of 9 years between them. 2 people who trusted each other so completely they'd stopped performing it for anyone, including each other. Washington Salvage and Restoration sat on Frankfort Avenue, on the industrial edge of the city, and it did not look like much from the road. That was by design. Inside, the yard ran with a precision that would have surprised anyone who judged it by the sign out front. Components logged, tagged, and rated within 24 hours of arrival. 3 bays kept clean in the specific functional way of a man who understood that order wasn't for show, it was for safety. There was nothing on the walls, no photographs, no citations, no unit insignia. Just a workbench, tools hung by silhouette, and in the corner of the second bay, a small shelf where Nora kept a second notebook for the afternoons she came by after school. The people who did business with Denzel knew him as a reliable supplier who priced fair and graded parts harder than anyone else in 3 counties. They did not know his rank. They did not know that 2 medals sat in a box under his bed for actions that were still classified, or that he had walked out of that life the day he decided he wanted his daughter to know her father's face better than she knew his absence. He had never told anyone because no one had ever asked, and because even if they had, it wasn't the kind of thing he carried around to hand out. He loaded the truck at 7:40. He dropped Nora at school. He pulled into the Halloway Tactical Fleet visitor lot at 9:11, 11 years into a company Diane Halloway had built into something worth $92 million in government contracts, and 49 minutes before the biggest morning of her professional life. Diane had been preparing for that morning for 6 months. Not casually, with the specific, exhausting totality of a woman who had spent 11 years proving to a defense contracting world built by and for men like her father that she hadn't just inherited the company, she'd earned it twice over. Halloway Tactical Fleet refurbished and maintained tactical vehicles for federal and state contracts. 61 employees, $58 million a year in revenue. And on the table that morning, a 5-year, $92 million contract with the Department of Defense, contingent entirely on how the next 8 hours went. She had read the review criteria more times than she could count. She had rehearsed the walkthrough with her operations director 3 separate times that week. She had replaced 2 pieces of equipment in Bay 3 not because they'd failed, but because they didn't photograph the way she needed them to. She had briefed every member of her senior team on their exact role in a level of detail her HR director, Renee Ashford, had privately described to her assistant as a lot. She was standing at the entrance in her tailored blazer at 9:14, watching the work truck pull in, when she noticed it because it was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just inconsistent. A salvage yard logo on the door panel, a bed loaded with axle housings, sitting in a lot that today held government sedans and the advance vehicles of a 3-star general's review team. She walked toward it. The man getting out was of average height, dark hair, a short beard going gray at the edges, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who had never once needed to prove he was in a hurry. "The service entrance is around back," Diane said. He looked at her, not defensively, not with any apology in it, just the flat, steady attention of a man who had decided years ago that being looked at was simply a thing that happened to him, and it didn't require a performance. "I've got a scheduled intake. 3 axle assemblies, 1 transfer case, cleared through your logistics coordinator Tuesday. People from salvage yards use the service entrance," Diane said. Her voice, her operations director would say later, carried more certainty than the moment called for. "This one's for clients." Go around. 2 of her staff laughed, the small, obligatory kind of laughter that happens when the person in charge says something, and everyone nearby understands they're supposed to find it funny. Denzel held her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he nodded once, picked up his clipboard, and walked around to the service entrance without another word. That was humiliation number 1, and Diane didn't think about it again for the next 40 minutes. She would think about it for a very long time after that. At the loading dock, Walt Higgins, who'd worked at Halloway for 7 years and processed Denzel's deliveries a dozen times, signed the receipt, checked the condition ratings, and told him the parts looked clean, same as always. Denzel folded the copy into his jacket pocket and started back through the south corridor toward his truck. He didn't make it. Diane intercepted him in the hallway, flanked now by her operations director, Grant Miller, and moving with the clipped energy of someone who'd had 40 minutes to build a grievance out of nothing. "Walt tells me the transfer case you brought in has a rebuild sticker on it that doesn't match the condition report," she said. Her voice had gone from dismissive to something sharper. "I want to know if you've been marking parts up before they get to us." Denzel stopped. "The sticker reflects a prior rebuild, disclosed on line 4 of the intake form. It's not hidden, it's documented." "It's convenient that it's documented after the fact." "It was documented before the truck left my yard, ma'am." "You're welcome to call the coordinator who cleared it Tuesday." "I don't need a lecture on my own intake process from a man who buys wrecked government surplus for pennies and resells it." Diane's voice had climbed enough now that 2 passing employees slowed to watch. "I built this company from nothing into something the federal government trusts with $92 million, and I am not going to have my name attached to a fraud complaint because I let a salvage yard cut corners on my loading dock the same week I've got a 3-star general walking through my door." Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am, if you think there's a discrepancy, I'd be glad to walk it through with your coordinator." "I'm not interested in an argument in a hallway." "You're not interested in much, are you?" Diane said, and something in her tone had turned personal now, aimed less at the parts and more at the man. "Truck like that, jacket like that. You people run these little operations for years and act insulted when someone asks question." Grant Miller looked at his shoes. Walt Higgins, standing near the dock door, looked at Denzel, then at the floor, and said nothing. That was humiliation number 2, and it landed in front of an audience. Denzel looked at her for a beat longer than he needed to, not with anger, with the particular stillness of a man deciding that being wronged was, most days, not worth the energy other people spent defending it. "I'll be in the visitor lot if your coordinator needs to reach me," he said, and walked away. He was 18 feet from his truck when the convoy arrived. 3 vehicles, government plates, the tight, deliberate spacing of an arrival that told you everything about the man in the center car before he ever stepped out. The lead door opened. General Lyle Foster, 62, 3 stars, the kind of bearing that 30 years in an institution built round precision leaves on a man whether he wants it or not, stepped out and swept the lot in the same 2-second red Denzel had used his whole career. A survival habit dressed up as a professional one. The general's eyes stopped on Denzel. Everyone near him stopped walking too. That was simply what happened when General Foster went still. He crossed the lot. Not toward Diane, whose hand was already half extended in greeting, not toward the entrance, not toward the schedule 6 weeks in the making. Straight toward the man in the salvage jacket. "Captain," Foster said, and put his hand out. "It's been a long time." Denzel shook it, firm, brief, general. "Congratulations on the 3rd star, sir." Something crossed the general's face that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "What in God's name are you doing at a parts intake bay, Washington?" "Running a salvage operation, Frankfurt Avenue, 4 years now." Foster studied him a moment too long to be casual. "You look like you're still working too hard." Then, without transition, "I need your eyes on something inside." "That's not a request, Captain," Denzel said. "Yes, sir," and fell into step at the general's left shoulder, not behind him, not in front, the exact positions soldiers occupy beside a superior officer they've actually worked with, not one they're performing rank for. Diane hadn't moved. She was still standing where she'd been when the general walked past her outstretched hand as if it wasn't there. Note: if you're watching this and you know what it feels like to be underestimated by someone who never bothered to ask your name, hit subscribe now. This channel exists for stories exactly like this one. I'll be right back with what happened in that briefing room. The tour that followed didn't go the way Diane had rehearsed it. General Foster's review panel asked questions her documentation couldn't answer. Questions about performance at altitude, about failure patterns under repeated stress, about the difference between what a spec sheet promised and what a vehicle actually did in the field. Every time her team hesitated, Colonel Mercer, the panel's lead assessor, looked past them to the quiet man standing at the general's shoulder, and Denzel answered, not with confidence performed for an audience, but with the flat, specific certainty of someone who had lived inside the answer for years before he ever needed to say it out loud. Diane's operations director stopped taking notes about 6 minutes in. He'd never seen his boss's composure slip in 9 years working for her, and it was slipping now in small ways only someone who'd watched her closely would catch. A longer pause before she spoke, her hand flattening against the folder in front of her like she needed something solid to hold on to. By the time they reached the briefing room, word had already moved through the building the way it does in places where everyone senses something has shifted before anyone says so out loud. The room held 16 people where 12 chairs had been set. Diane's team on one side, General Foster's panel on the other. Foster at the head. And Denzel, seated to the general's left in a chair that hadn't been on the laminated seating chart Diane's assistant had printed that morning. A chart now sitting a face down under the table's edge where the general's aide had placed it without a word. Diane sat at her assigned seat and held her professional composure the way she'd trained herself to for 16 years. Renee Ashford, her HR director, sat 2 seats down and noticed, the way people who watch faces for a living notice, that her boss's hands hadn't stopped moving since they'd walked in. The technical review went through documentation, standards, compliance. Then it reached the part of the morning nobody in that room would forget. Colonel Mercer asked about drive-train degradation above 9,000 feet. Diane's lead technician read the published spec off a page. Mercer looked at the page, looked at Diane, then looked at Denzel without being asked. Denzel leaned forward. Beyond the published number, the degradation curve isn't linear. Above roughly 9.2 with standard fuel mapping, you're losing 12 to 17% power and pushing coolant into the warning band inside 40 minutes of sustained load. Fix is an altitude-compensating fuel map and a coolant cap upgrade from 16 psi to 20. Both are field serviceable. Neither's ours in the documentation because the documentation was written for conditions the vehicle was designed for, not the ones it actually sees. Mercer set his pen down, picked it back up. The dude's civilian technical analyst, a woman named Carol Boyd, who'd assessed military vehicle contracts for 2 decades, asked next about torsion bar fatigue, about rebuild thresholds. Diane's operations director produced a manufacturer protocol from a binder. Boyd looked at the page, then at Denzel. Manufacturer's threshold is 15% deviation from spec, Denzel said. In the field, that's too loose on one end and too tight on the other, depending on load history. A bar that's taken 3 heavy drop events in a month can measure in spec and still have fatigue damage that fails in the fields inside 200 kilometers. You don't just measure the bar, you measure the history. That's why my intake protocol includes a loading interview with the vehicle's last operating unit, wherever we can get one. You built that yourself, Boyd said. It wasn't a question. 4 years ago, started seeing the same failure pattern come through the yard enough times that it stopped being a coincidence. Then General Foster asked the last question himself, looking only at Denzel. What's the single most common failure you see in restored tactical vehicles once they're back in service? Electrical ground integrity, Denzel said. Every restoration program addresses the mechanical damage people can see. Almost none of them systematically check ground point corrosion. It doesn't fail on day one. It fails 18 to 36 months out in the field as an intermittent fault that looks like something else. Fix adds 4 hours per vehicle at restoration. It eliminates a failure mode that's currently running about 23% of field electrical complaints on restored units. The room went quiet. 3 small nods moved down the panel, one at a time. General Foster looked at Diane. I want Washington Salvage's intake protocol and ground remediation procedure written into the contract's technical annex as a mandatory standard, not a recommendation. General, our current contractor network, as a condition, Foster said, and closed his folder, and that was the end of the conversation. But it was not the end of the morning. Renee Ashford had been sitting 2 seats from her boss through all of it, and she had also been standing in the hallway 40 minutes earlier when Diane accused a stranger of fraud in front of 2 employees, and she had been standing at the entrance when Diane told a man to use the service entrance because of the jacket he wore. Renee had spent 9 years at Halloway building a reputation for fairness that mattered more to her than her paycheck, and she now had a decision sitting in front of her that had nothing to do with contracts. She waited until the review panel filed out for a break. Then she walked up to General Foster's aide in the corridor, and in a voice low enough that only he could hear it, she told him what she'd witnessed that morning, the hallway, the accusation, the words used, all of it in order, with times attached, because she'd written them down the moment she got back to her office, in case she ever needed to. She hadn't known, when she wrote it down, that she'd need it inside 2 hours. The aide relayed it to General Foster during the break. Foster read the 2 pages Renee had typed without any change in his expression, the way a man reads something he already suspected, but had hoped he was wrong about. Then he asked to speak with Diane alone. They stood in the small conference room off the main hallway. Foster set the 2 pages on the table between them. Miss Halloway, I've spent 32 years watching people size each other up in about 2 seconds. I did it in this parking lot myself this morning. It's not something I'm proud of as a habit, but it's kept people alive, so I don't apologize for it. What I do apologize for is any officer or contractor who does the same thing and gets it deliberately, repeatedly wrong in front of witnesses about a man who happens to be one of the most decorated soldiers I've had the honor to command. Diane's face had gone very still. General, I'm not finished. Your HR director came to my aid on her own, unprompted, and gave a written account of 2 separate incidents this morning in which you disparaged a vendor's character, profession, and personal presentation in front of your own staff. That is not a technical compliance issue. That is a conduct issue, and as of an hour ago, it is now part of the file the department will review before this contract is finalized. $92 million doesn't just require a company that builds good vehicles, Miss Halloway. It requires a culture the federal government can stand behind publicly. Right now, I have a documented account that makes me nervous about yours. Diane sat down slowly, the folder still in her hands, her fingers gone white at the edges of it. What do you need from me? She said, and it came out smaller than anything she'd said all morning. 3 things, Foster said. 1, Washington Salvage's protocol goes into the contract as a mandatory standard, which I've already ordered. 2, You personally address your full staff before the end of this week in a setting your HR director signs off on, and you correct the record about what happened this morning. Not a memo, not an email. You in a room in front of the people who watched it. 3, I want a formal apprenticeship commitment attached to this contract, funded by Halloway. Minimum 2 positions a year for 3 years, real technical training, real wages. If those 3 things happen, and happen honestly, I will tell the department this company's culture is one worth continued trust. If they don't, I will tell them the opposite, and no technical score in the world will save the number on that contract. Diane didn't answer for a long moment. When she did, her voice had lost the certainty it carried in the parking lot that morning. He never said a word, she said, the whole time. He could have told me who he was the second I opened my mouth, and it would have ended it instantly. He let me keep going. That's not weakness, Miss Halloway, Foster said, standing. That's a man who's spent his whole life believing people shouldn't have to know his resume to be treated like they matter. You found out the hard way what the rest of us already knew. He left her sitting there with the 2 typed pages and the sound of the building moving on without her. The review panel's vehicles pulled out at 2:47. By 3 o'clock, the facility had gone quiet in the specific way places go quiet after something enormous has just finished happening around them. Diane found Denzel still in the parking lot. Foster had asked him to stay available for follow-up questions, and he'd spent the early afternoon answering 2 more of them by phone from the break room, eating a sandwich Renee's assistant had brought him without being asked. Diane crossed the lot and stopped a few feet from him. I owe you an apology, she said, not a polite one. A real one. What I said to you this morning about the truck, about the jacket, about the fraud, none of it was based on anything you'd actually done. It was based on what you looked like standing in my lot. I've spent 16 years telling my own staff never to make that mistake, and I made it in front of 6 of them before 9:30. Denzel looked at her, not coldly, with the same steadiness he'd used all morning. I appreciate you saying that. Why didn't you stop me? You could have told me who you were the second I said it. 1 sentence. It would have changed everything I said after that. That's exactly why I didn't say it, Denzel said. If a sentence about my service record is the only thing that keeps someone from talking to me like I'm nothing, then the sentence didn't fix anything. It just moved the problem somewhere I couldn't see it anymore. I was a man in a salvage jacket making a delivery. If that wasn't enough on its own, my rank wasn't going to fix what was actually broken. Diane was quiet for a long moment. The general's going to make me stand in front of my whole company and say what I did, out loud, with everyone watching. He's not making you do anything you didn't do first, Denzel said, without cruelty, just fact. You did it in a hallway with an audience. He's asking you to fix it with one, too. Seems fair to me. She almost laughed, and it came out closer to something breaking than something lighter. You could have let me twist for longer than this. Most people would have. I'm not interested in you twisting, Denzel said. I'm interested in the next person who walks into your lot in work clothes getting a different morning than I got. She held his eyes, and something in her face shifted, not performed, not smoothed over for an audience, just the particular exhaustion of a person setting something down they'd been carrying wrong for a long time. Then I want the apprenticeship program built the way you'd build it. Not the way that looks good in a press release. The way that actually teaches someone something. 2 per year. Real work, real pay, not observation. 2 per year, she said, and put her hand out. He shook it once. 4 days later, in a room that normally held company all-hands meetings and nothing more dramatic than quarterly numbers, Diane Halloway stood in front of 61 employees and told them exactly what she had said to a vendor in her own parking lot, why she had said and why it was wrong, not in the language of a press release, but in her own words, with her voice audibly unsteady through the first 2 minutes of it. Renee Ashford stood near the back, arms crossed, watching a woman she'd worked for 9 years do something harder than any contract negotiation she'd ever run. Grant Miller, who had looked at his shoes in that hallway instead of saying anything, didn't look away this time. Diane did not ask for forgiveness. She said she didn't expect it and wasn't owed it. She said the company was implementing a mandatory review of vendor and staff interaction standards, effective immediately, with an outside auditor reporting directly to the board, not her, for the next 18 months. She said the apprenticeship program with Washington Salvage and Restoration would begin within 60 days, and that she would be personally accountable for its outcomes, not delegating it to someone whose name would be easier to forget if it failed. It cost her something visible to say all of it. People in that room would talk about it for months, not with cruelty, but with the specific respect people reserve for someone who chose the harder version of an apology when the easier one was sitting right there. The Department of Defense contract was confirmed 6 weeks later, with the technical annex General Foster had ordered written in word for word. And with a conduct oversight clause neither Diane nor her legal team had ever had to include in a federal contract before. It would remain in every contract Halloway Tactical Fleet signed for the next 5 years. The first 2 apprentices started 60 days after that. One of them, a 19-year-old named Malik Turner from 2 streets off Frankfurt Avenue, found a suspension fatigue issue on his 3rd day using the loading history protocol Denzel had built, a vehicle that would have failed in the field at roughly 200 kilometers. It didn't because somebody had paid attention once, written it down, and passed on to somebody else who was paying attention too. That evening, after Nora had finished her homework and Denzel had reviewed the draft advisory agreement Halloway's legal team had sent over, he went out to the garage to close up for the night. On the corner of the workbench next to the toolbox was a medal, not framed, not displayed, just set there the way Nora set things down when she wanted him to know she'd seen something without turning it into a conversation he had to manage. He picked it up, held it in his palm for longer than he usually let himself. Nora appeared in the doorway with her notebook. "The general knew you the whole time, didn't he?" "The right people usually do," Denzel said. "She wrote something down and didn't tell him what it was." He put the medal back on the bench, and for the first time in 4 years, he didn't put it back in the box. Somewhere in a drawer in that house was a second coffee mug he still poured for out of habit some mornings and emptied without drinking from. He never explained it to anyone, and nobody had ever asked, and some things he decided a long time ago didn't need explaining to be understood. Note, if this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever watched someone get underestimated by a room that had no idea who they were actually looking at? Tell me about it below. And if you want more stories like this one, about ordinary people carrying extraordinary depth nobody bothered to ask about, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.